Thank you, Avel, for joining this Tehnologos podcast mini-series. I'm really pleased that you said yes to this invitation, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to kind of dive into the free energy principle, active inference, and how all of this relates to your current work that you're doing. So maybe like for start, maybe we could slowly kind of introduce free energy principles and situate it into this problem space, like what kind of problem is it trying to solve, and slowly go from there. So how you see this kind of research trajectory that is now gaining traction and kind of evolving with rapid pace and attention to it.
Okay, so what it is, what it does, and how does it do it? Is that the spirit of the question?
Basically, and what kind of problems is it tackling? Like,
Okay.
maybe you can put it.
So the IFP, or free energy principle, is at core a mathematical statement, or maybe a set of related mathematical statements, because you have an evolution of the specific formalism in time. If you have a dynamical system, so a dynamical system is a system that has a set of states, and those move in time. For example, if I have this and I drop it, the section of the movement where it is accelerated follows a specific rule in a specific space, and that makes it a dynamical system. And assume that this dynamical system is stochastic, so you have noise, you have thermal noise, so you have kind of oscillation of things as they are being stimulated, for example, in a gas by the random movement of particles. And further, suppose that you have a partition between internal and external states, so that both are independent given the states of B, which means that all information about all information about the relation between the internal and the external states are in the boundary state. Then you can define information geometry, which is simply a function that takes point in space and gives you a probability. And this basically gives you for each internal state a belief or a probability expression over external states. And the internal flow of the system minimizes a quantity that is called variational free energy. And that means that the flow of the system optimally infers the nature of external states given certain constraints and based on boundary states. So this is the math level. You have different formulation. You have things that are more specific. I will not go into that. This is the core idea. And what it means, more specifically, is that if you have a system that works this way and that minimizes free energy through perception and action, we can claim that its dynamics work to confirm a model, a world model that corresponds to its dynamics. So everything the agent does works to gather evidence for a model that is the agent. So this is a bit of a linguistic trick, but it is also interesting from a ontologic perspective. And this is what Howie called self-evidencing. And this entire idea has initially been proposed as an explanation for why do our brain mere physical system that have specific states in them can do intentional behavior, can have things like belief and goals, etc., etc., and how they can basically organize themselves to respond to the environment adaptively. How can you optimally infer what is around you and optimally infer what you are going to do? This is computationally when you are beyond a certain dimensionality and you are in a situation of ambiguity and you have specific energy boundaries that you cannot possibly overcome. This is not a possible problem to solve directly. So what you do is you do not try to make up an entire model of everything in your head and then run a simulation of that. You will engage adaptively with the world by forming expectation about what you do, what it is supposed to entail, and what is out there at a very basic perceptive level. So I see a computer, and I know that if I go with my hand like this, I will touch the computer. If I go like this, it will fall, and this is a bad thing for me. So I won't do that. And I do not have to entertain a complex calculation for every possible scenario. I just expect things to go bad if I do that, so I don't do that. So it is a pretty powerful model in that capacity because it solves two problems. One is a computational problem. How does our cognition work so well in so complicated space? And two, how can we have mere blobs of flesh that do things that seems intentional, that do things that seem to entail quite specific understanding of their environments? That is, I would say, the two core contribution of the FEP.
Okay, that's a great introduction. Maybe like a side question would be that like this is mathematical formalism from physics, as you just described some of the principles from it, but it's a general description of any type of systems interaction with the environment, I would say. So like it's
almost
also
any type. You need to have a specific kind of coupling.
Yeah, but this specific type of coupling is related to this sustenance through time, through which a system retains its configuration in this interaction with the environment that it's modeling through attaining these preferable states through the boundary. But this is such a general description that it kind of broadens our perspective of what a living system, for example, is, and it potentially kind of includes some other systems that wouldn't normally be a part of classical classifications between, I don't know, living or non-living system and things like that. So maybe I'm interested here in how kind of what kind of novel starting points of perspectives it introduced on this level, and also like what are some of the interesting changes that happen through this broadening, for example, of what falls into this category of systems engaging with their environment.
Okay, that is pretty wide. Let me take a moment to decide what I want to say, because I could go in like 6 different directions from that. So, if I may reframe, your question is what kind of change of perspective the FEP brings, notably in the difference between systems like us and systems like presumably mindless particles, photons out there doing things.
For example, yes. Okay,
so what the FEP does is to give, let us say, neutral or natural language to describe a specific kind of processes, which is the process of adaptation that comes when two systems come into contact. It does not say anything about whether this system is a photon, or whether the system is a rock, or whether this system is a frog, or a brain, or a computer. This is basically distinction that are left to the specific description of the system as a mimical system. So for example, if I would describe to you the mix of a rock, well, I would not do that because it would be a bit long and boring, but still quite short as compared to what I would need to do to explain the mix of a frog. Also, I have, we have some level of confidence that we can exhaustively describe a rock. It's hard, you have to measure a lot of stuff, but it's doable. A frog is harder. So the entire question of what categories of system are described by the FEP are left by, are left to the work of the modeler, the person that decides that this system, the frog, is to be represented by this set of equations. You do have some distinctions that are made within the FEP, especially in more recent paper, path integral, particular things, and particular kinds and strange things, which are distinction between a basically inert particle, like a rock that does not do things, it's affected but doesn't affect. Active particles, which are particles that do things, and strange particles, which basically cannot observe directly that do have active states, but cannot observe them. And it is the case in which you get your engagement becomes a kind of belief, your engagement with the world is driven by an implicit model of you as an agent. So it's the case where you have the full theoretical apparatus. But again, essentially, what makes the system I describe, a frog or a rock or whatever, is the set of equations that I choose or would in principle choose to describe the specific system. So the FP does not in of itself say much about these distinctions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because like I was reading, for example, that FEP is, for example, a scale-free theory or non-reductionist theory to kind of explaining these things. And at the same time, it's kind of almost like a transcendental description of systems' interaction with their environment, because it, again, as we kind of already slightly touched upon, it provides a general description of systems' interaction with the environment. And in that sense, you don't need to know anything in advance about the specific type of interaction. You already have a type of modeling space to insert any type of thing in it.
This is like the principle of least action. If I state it, I just tell you the path that a particle will take is the path of least action. This is a formal tool. This is not in of itself a statement about anything.
Yeah, precisely. But yeah, precisely. But like I'm interested in this generality because, for example, like free energy principle, it's not simply a theory; it's a principle. It kind of has like it has a greater purchase on, for example, these kind of questions than a simple theory would have, because it kind of proposes that it can provide kind of a first principles approach to kind of modeling this problem. So I'm kind of interested in how you see this kind of dynamic from, for example, something that is simply a theory to something that is more of a theory or a broader thing that is principle. Because also in relation to these questions, if free energy principle is just a model of, let's say, agents' interaction with the environment, or if it has this kind of ontological purchase on reality that each agent simply by existing, for example, has to minimize free energy. So I'm interested in this distinction, for example, and what is your kind of perspective on these questions?
Okay. So I would not say that the FEP has more or less authority than, I don't know, a theory of semiotic distinction in young people in Hungary from 14 to 17, because there is a category mistake. The target is not the same. The FEP is math, and it says that such statement is actually equivalent to such statement in a mathematical space. The theory about social distinction in Hungary, it's a theory about social distinction in Hungary. So you have a specific commitment that you are describing this thing, and you are doing so in a hopefully relevant manner that hopefully meets the standard of, how do you say, rigor, discipline that your field expects, etc., etc. So there is no like kind of conflict or a comparison to be had between the FEP and field-specific theories. What you can or cannot do is frame a theory from the FEP. So, for example, I can claim that young organic people from 14 to 17 actually expect themselves to act in a very I don't know, masculine manner, because this is what is nowadays mainstream. So, because they are I'm now making up that they are also males, else the argument does not work. Because they are the famous males, they expect themselves to act as a man. And so because this norm exists, you kind of have, because of the FEP, they're kind of drawn not only to act in this specific way, but also to frame situation in a way that is coherent with their identity. And then you have a theory of something that is tied to the FEP. And then we can compare my FEP grounded theory of something to other theories. And I would say that, yeah, the fact that you have kind of a strong claim that your theory is actually grounded in some kind of first principle of the mind, it makes it quite authoritative. If you can make the connection with your subject work, I would say you have a pretty good theory. And this is it is basically 80% of my business to do social theory and claim it is somehow related to the FEP and make the argument about the social identity that I just made. Yeah, this being said, that yeah, the core information for me is that you do not have a meaningful competition between the FEP and field-specific theories, because the goal is not the same. The goal of the FEP is to provide, I would say, some kind of grounding mathematical theory, some kind of language to describe a set of phenomena that are all described as adaptive engagement. It is not in itself, it cannot give you information about anything unless you do the work of framing something within the language of the FEP.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I see. Maybe like when I didn't read the entirety of the paper of the map territory fallacy, but like what I gathered from it, or what was my impression, was simply that if, for example, there is no map territory fallacy in FEP, then its FEP is more of a constraint than if it's simply a model of something.
Yep.
And for example, if something is simply a model, then it immediately gets reabsorbed into, I don't know, how knowledge gets produced, or this kind of, it immediately becomes a social thing and not kind of more objective kind of parameter of reality. And for example, these questions, for example, are tied to, let's say, also to the distinction between, let's say, social constructivism versus participatory realism. So, for example, that's how I kind of approached or saw this distinction, because in both of those cases, reality is kind of mediated by social actors, but the status of knowledge is different in the first and the second case, because in the social constructivism, the status of knowledge it's more relativistic, let's say, or kind of it's completely encapsulated in this kind of social configuration. Whereas in the participatory realism, even if it's enacted, it's objective and in that sense external to the agent, and it's based on this kind of constraint that is this kind of loop with the environment. So maybe I'm interested in this kind of distinctions, or how you kind of see it.
Okay, so you bring up like 3 different things, so it will be a quite long answer. You can choose to get back on any of the points I will make. First, I absolutely do not buy the concept of an as-if explanation. I think at even an ethical level, you are committed to some form of naturalism. So the attempt to describe nature, at least a good faith attempt to describe natural entities and natural structure. And for reasons that are, I would say, quite obvious, you cannot have a theoretical model of anything. You have to use, language to describe stuff. You need to invent the concept of temperature to measure temperature. There is no statement that is fully neutral theoretically, and there is absolutely no way that you can describe a reality in its own terms, because you are not temperature, you are someone who talks about it. And there will be, brain function that goes into that. But the fact that you cannot possibly have a neutral, complete, unbiased, objective model of nature does not mean that you cannot at least make an effort to be coherent in the claims that you make. I would say that a naturalistic démarche necessarily shows something that I call ontological commitment, which means that you commit to the set of entities that you postulate, and you work from that. And you are very explicit about what those entities are. You are very explicit about the relation between them, and you are very explicit about the kind of explanation that you work with. So, for example, you cannot go around and claim that you explain frogness. Okay, this is a bit loaded. I will try to find another example. You cannot go around. Okay, so you know Latour, I imagine. You cannot go around claiming that the concept of what was it? I have it in French, but yeah, whichever illness that I think it was Ramses II died from is actually I don't remember which one it was. Let's say good. So the important is that it was a historical term that was used, but today it lacked medical meaning. And when Latour says that it is good, so again, not the real illness, the entailment of that is that the terms by which people back then described reality are not illegitimate. They are actually a valid, coherent description of reality. And I would say by that, this is not trying to disarm it, but you cannot go from there and claim that you explain why the sun is there because someone said sun. That does not have any kind of, sorry, you cannot explain why this specific virus or bacteria developed. That is not, your theory does not talk about that. It is not part of the entity that you postulated. You cannot say that. In the same way, you cannot do, I don't know, physics of crystals, spin crystals, and claim that it somehow explains elections. I know someone who did that. That does not work. We don't do that. And so, yeah, you need to have a good faith, commitments to specify what entities you postulate, what they do, how they work, etc., etc. And that means either the claim of some kind of structural correspondence between your model and the system that you describe, which I would say is the standard epistemology of life sciences, and is, how to say, I don't think we can have that, but at the very least, you need to strive toward coherence between a specific formalized, I said explicit, but I'm saying it again, explicit theoretical model of things, and the entities that are out there and that you imagine are actually constituting the thing. And this is something that you lose when you talk about as-if explanation. Everything happens as if aliens abducted me and put me in a simulation where everything happens as if it happens now. Yeah, sure. But you need, at some point, some kind of commitment to entities that exist to explain things in a way that is naturalistic. And when you talk about as-if explanation, this is something that you go away from. So, in my opinion, the fact that everything happens as if the FEP was true does not have any bearing whatsoever on anything. The question is whether we can actually take it at face value, assume that things actually are like this, and go somewhere with it. So to be clear, I absolutely recognize that the FEP is not a model, it's a principle, and principles do not have one-to-one correspondence or coherence. That is not a thing. You have a model when you try to solve a system, and then you have these kind of constraints. Principles are, again, formal statements. They are statements of equivalence within a theory, and there is no real way to falsify or verify them. This is just a property of the language that you chose to use. But the fact that your statement is true, well, coherent within a theoretical framework, here the framework of the dynamical system theory, does not mean that it applies to anything at all. You can say a lot of things that are true and that do not mean things. White is white. My dog is blue. I do not have a dog. My dog is blue is both true from a phenomenological perspective and nonsensical. So the question is, what kind of insight you can build from FEP into a natural system? And again, assuming that everything in the FEP, the world is as is described by the FEP. And then you have a lot of problems because there are a lot of things that are not assumed by the FEP, that are not coherent with the FEP, and that actually occur in natural systems. One of them is aging and death. Things do not age in the FEP because it's a stochastic dynamical system. It has a distribution, and they stay the same a long time. This is what it means, and this is why we can do this weird math jutsu of the thing and bring about intentional states from mere dynamics. So you cannot have systems that, you cannot describe a system within the FEP and then claim that this system can age, that it can die. That is not a possibility that you have, because you have defined away the very concept of death and aging. So this is related to a broader question on how and whether the FEP describes life. So I would say good core of FEP proponents also claim that it underwrites enactive theory, autopoiesis theory. Both are related but not identical. Same people push them, and they mean, as far as we are concerned here, the same thing. I will get rage from that, but okay, let's work from there. The point is that, for example, within the autopoiesis theory and following theory I am more familiar with, you kind of, how to say, you constantly observe that living systems have a form of coherence that is maintained through time, and that this coherence can change in specific ways, such as aging, learning, death, etc., etc. And this process is explained by a concept that you have, I think, at least 6 variants of this concept that mean subtly different things. I will use the concept of operational closure. A system is coherent because there is a set of processes that maintain and reconstruct its organization. Okay, and this process can fail. This process can be modified. This process can do pretty much anything. That we just call them processes. We just describe them in organizational terms, and because we explain the coherence of the agent through them, and we do not assume them to be infallible, yeah, anything can go actually. We can change, we can learn, etc., etc. We did not say a lot about how it works because the theory is informal, but we admit this possibility within the formalism. In the FEP, there is coherence, there is a structural identity of the agent that is maintained because we supposed it. We describe a dynamical system, those have a rule that define them. So yeah, the rule is coherent. And the model, the world model that is actually does the heavy lifting within the FEP, the information geometry, it is just entailed by the dynamical formulation of the system. So we did not explain coherence, we have assumed coherence. And maybe the work we did within that has some kind of implication how agents actually maintain the coherence. I think it does, because it does work to explain adaptive engagements. And this is actually a big part of why we exist. If I was, I don't know, stabbing myself with a pen, I would not keep living. And rather than doing things that are dangerous to my body, I learned how not to do that, and I don't do them. And I do some of the things instead that I expect myself to do. And I think that the FEP, well, active inference, entailment, the cognitive entailment of the FEP is, yeah, pretty much the only explanation around that actually underwrites how I can do it so adaptively, so often, so well, with the very limited energy resources of this and the very high level of ambiguity in the environment. So I talked a lot, but this is important. This brings us to participatory realism, which is related but different thing from social constructivism. So I did not took the time to how do we say do my lecture, do my reading on that. But I would describe social constructivism as the idea that the concepts with which we describe the world are actually made up. Someone invented them for reasons that are idiosyncratic. And often with constructivism, you have some form of relativism, which is the claim that they are all legitimate or even all equally legitimate, which no one holds because there are ways to see the world that we consider as bad. But okay, so this is at least we can agree in principle that the Occidental scientific way to see things is not more or less valid than the way of seeing people that we know of the Ashrar, or if they are more or less, they are in very specific terms that they themselves invented, and we have to have some, reflection about this. So this, I would say, is a good faith description of social constructivism. Participatory realism is the claim that once we made something up, it actually exists as a causal force. So for example, someone made up the letter A. Now I can write the letter A and communicate with it. This is a thing that have causal power that we made up. And more generally, the letters is quite, I would say, for example, more generally, when you are a cognitive agent, again, because of the constraints of on information processing, you cannot just compute everything all the time. That is not a thing. What you do is that you learn to recognize very specific signs that you interpret in very specific ways. So, for example, this is how do you say an e-smoke, and this signifies that I could take it and smoke it. I did not come to this conclusion through extensive computation of the observable properties of this. I just know that it is, and now I see it as an e-smoke. And you could probably change it to something else that has the same general shape and function, and I would not notice. I've used this thing for months, and you keep the function for me. You keep the very specific traits that allow me to identify it. I will absolutely not notice the difference. Because again, I see the world as a system of signs that have the meaning of enabling or inviting specific actions. And this, I will hammer it, but it is a necessary property for a cognitive system to work. And this means that the specific idiosyncratic way in which I decided to see, to recognize an e-smoke actually has causal power over my dynamic. And this is not a thing that you can reconstruct within mechanical system theory, because again, mechanical system theory, you just assume the dynamic in the definition of the system. So I think that the FEP goes some way to explain, or at least ground, or at least make meaningful the abstract idea, the not metaphysical, but ontological claim, well, epistemo-ontological claim of participatory realism, but it does not go all the way, and this is the thing that I've been hammering for years, and that I think brought me here.
Yeah, no, thank you for this really concise response. And maybe maybe you can just kind of proceed with what you ended on, because, for example, in that paper that I was already referencing, in physics of creation paper, you are kind of pointing precisely these limits within the current FEP formulation, or kind of even the formal properties behind it. And you claim there specifically that it isn't capable to model, for example, things that are fundamental to life, precisely, for example, creation, transformation, processes like metamorphosis and things like that. So can you again kind of explain the problem, and do you see the possibility of the theory being adapted or transformed in the way that it could tackle these dynamics as well?
So, because you cite physics of creation, I will go the quite grand, pompous route to the point. This is the most coherent with my approach in the paper. So basically, here in the West, we like to explain things with laws. And we have formalized it as part of the scientific revolution. And it is still the dominant epistemology within physics. And yeah, that's it, physics. And what it means is that we need to have a statement, a specific statement, and the statements name specific entities and names relation between entities, and the statement of the relation is construed to explain the instances of the relation. So for example, I will see something fall, I will, second law of Newton, action and reaction, something. So this is not, I'm not claiming this is bad and stupid. We got to helicopters and telephones and a lot of technical impressive things. So clearly we were doing something right. However, from the moment you want to explain things with laws, you need to name things. You need to have specific ideas about the categories of things that are and their relation. And this means that you have to use, well, technically, this translates in a state space. State space is just the space of possibility in which you frame a system. And it is a very basic tool in physics, so basic, in fact, that no one will tell you about it. They will just tell you, this is the equation. No one will tell you, we assume that the system is reduced to 3 dimensions of motion and to 3 dimensions of, how do you say, momentum. Sorry, 3 dimensions of position and 3 dimensions of speed, or position, momentum, or speed and momentum alone. No, that one does not work, sorry. So you will just be given equations and told that it somehow corresponds to a thing in the world. And if you talk about falling things, yeah, that's fine. Maybe your thing is, elastic. Maybe it has muscle, and then you need to account for more degrees of freedom. But essentially, the basic statement that things fall is true, and you can always, if your system is in fact more complicated than you expected, then you add the complication to your set of equation, and you ask, either you simulate it or you ask a Russian mathematician to come up with an analytical solution. But in a sense, it works. Conceptually, it works. Maybe it will be hard, but it works. Now think of a system that actively decides to make up dimension along the way. So, for example, a system that decides that, no, I'm not this dynamical system anymore. Now I want to read, and I will write things. And these things have an entirely novel meaning that does not reduce to my constitutive equations. And imagine you accumulate this over generation and generation and generation and generation and generation. Then the explanatory context does not hold. Maybe you have laws. So, for example, you have scaling laws in biology. This is very well known. Because of physical constraints, your mass and the volume of your muscle need to relate in a very specific way. And so in the right space, you have very nice, how do you say, line. And every single thing that exists in the entire world is quite close to that line. And we have pretty solid reason to believe that everything that could possibly exist is also near that line. But one thing that you cannot do is to explain specifically how the system escapes the state space and what occurs afterward, because your mathematical framing, maybe by tradition, maybe by necessity tied to the very concept of mathematics, I don't know at this point, assumes this constraint over the activity of a system, and you have to work with that somehow. So this entire problem is the problem, I think, canonically called creative evolution, that is mostly tied to a guy called Strack Kaufman. So I highly recommend that you take a look at Strack Kaufman. He's not exactly a quantum theory woo-woo warmonger. It is very serious research that is grounded in theories of biological organization. And I have yet to come to any kind of either mild rebuttal of any of these points. If they exist, I'm not aware of it, and I've looked for it, so I don't think they exist at this point. Also, the initial claim seems coherent. So where you have the term of creation that comes in, it's because of a simple argument. Either you assume that possibilities are made up along the way, and then you have patriarchalism, participatory realism, or you assume that all physical possibilities were there, at least in potential, at creation. So this assumes, I would say this assumes something a bit more than a Big Bang, you know, a point of origin of physics as we know it, because you need it not only for something to, you know, the Christian act of creation, from something to become there, even though it was not, there was nothing from it to grow from, but also it needs kind of, you know, how do you say that without sounding caricatural? But some kind of prior order to the thing. And I do not see how, where it would come from. I do not see how physically it would work, because so from what we know, from what I know of the physics of observation, even outside a quantum context, you need to invest work to bring about information about system. And so I cannot really buy the idea that the universe just came on fully specified with all the laws already made, etc., etc. Because the laws are regularities, and we need work to observe them, and work cannot be, we cannot have work be prior to the universe. It is not a meaningful statement to make. So yeah, the use of the term creation is a way to point to that and to say, well, either the universe was created in this way, or at least created itself maybe, or you have the potential for bringing about new things along the way for creation to be ongoing, which is kind of, this is kind of a theological framing, and I'm not sure I used it well. My point being that I think we have to accept that biological thing can actually bring about novel states in the world, or something made all the possibilities along the way. And yeah, this sounds very Christian metaphysics to me. Yeah, that's it, I think.
Yeah, no, don't apologize. No, I mean, that's fascinating. When I kind of read, because the interaction in free energy principle is mediated through the boundary, this Markov blanket in the official formulation. For example, then Chris Fields, you cite him in the paper, he kind of modifies the role of the blanket, or at least kind of gives it this quantum formalism to it. But I'm interested to know more about this interaction through the blanket, because, and specifically, I know if this makes sense within this framework, but when I think about the blanket, I think about one system trying to predict the other system without knowing anything about it, for example. And through this interaction, the two systems remain distinct between one another. And even through increasingly sophisticated predictions, distinction still remains between them. Distinction still remains between them. So like the role of the system that another system is trying to predict has this kind of objective status, the role of an environment, like a purely kind of, we don't usually ascribe subjectivity to, for example, systems that we try to predict. So I'm interested in if, for example, subjectivity is precisely a process where this line, this boundary gets blurred, or it becomes more porous, and then it becomes entangled between both of the entities, and that's why kind of the effects are different or kind of lead to a different kind of process of development between them.
Yeah. So this is the one of the problem I would have with the FEP. I will distinguish between fields or quantum FEP and freestone or classical FEP. So this is one of the problem I have with the classical FEP. It is that it is asymmetric. I would say at least an active theory entails that you have some kind of asymmetry between an agent and the environment that allows the agent to define the norms of interaction and to engage with the environment as they please. This translation is not warranted within the FEP. You can work on the strange particle that infer some actions versus active or inert particle. You can do that, but this is not quite the same distinction that is being made. So you also have the quantum FEP that is much more open-ended because it just assumes that the system have an Hamiltonian in a strange category theoretical formulation that does not, I think, entail a predefined state space or dynamics. And this system, they are driven toward entanglement, so non-differentiation, individuation as a new whole, which is not a trait shared by the classical FEP, by the way. And they are so through specific interaction norms that are brought about within the interaction. This looks more like us defining a language and then acting along in the terms defined by the language to me. But you come quickly to a problem because this is not dynamical system theory we're working with. This is quantum information theory, and not only quantum information theory, but quantum information theory framed within infomorphic category theoretical formalism. So you don't have to understand category theory, just understand that it is the most general possible framing of mathematics. So, okay, we admit in principle the evolution of new norms and maybe new states as, the states that are relevant to norms interaction. But we have no clue whatsoever how those are brought about or relate to the dynamics of the system, because we have just defined the dynamics of the system as whatever bring those norms. So I think we are stuck when it's something that is not quite DST and it's not quite quantum information theory. But sorry, what was your question?
Like the role
of
the role of the
boundary.
Yeah, the role of the boundary, and if subjectivity is a way to, for example, you use the metaphor or the analogy of kind of starting to speak the same language, and for example, then when this happens, does the separation still remain, or like because subjectivity, for example, in a philosophical sense, let's say, is to shift the other from an external position to an internal position. If I give subjectivity, I don't know, to nature, for example, in animism and things like that, I include it inside of myself. I kind of transform the relationship I have with it. Whereas if I take subjectivity from something, I exclude it from myself. What has been done, for example, through, let's say, dehumanization or various ways to exclude someone. So I'm interested, how you see this dynamic, and if you think that, for example, the boundary between this interaction between, for example, Alice and Bob does give us an interesting perspective to understand, for example, these two things.
Yeah. So, okay. So again, there is a big difference between classical FEP and quantum FEP on how we define the boundary. Classical FEP means there is a boundary. It is there. It is states that we defined. And because of this boundary, we can develop information geometry, beliefs, something like subjectivity. in the quantum FEP, the boundary is, if I recall correctly, it is defined by the activity of the system, and so you have a sense that subjectivity constructs the boundary of the system. So you have something more like, what I call post-realism. So the point I was trying to build at is that I cannot answer your question because I do not think there is such a thing as objectivity. Because if you subscribe to not quantum, so there is a position that Friesen defined that is called Markov monism. So the idea that everything there is Markov blankets all the way down. I would not say that, but I would subscribe to a quite radical constructivist view. That entails that, there is only interaction, and all entities that I can observe are constructed by interaction in a specific mode. And in the context of thermodynamics or quantum physics, so the physics that deal most importantly with information, there is the notion that observation is interaction. There is no meaningful difference between the two. So if a system is defined by interaction, it is defined by the norms of interaction. And this is, again, something like parspecial realism, as this is an instance of it. So the interaction between, protons is something that is constructive, also constructive of something very simple, and also in that context, very constrained by the prior law of physics, or as I would prefer to frame it, the pre-existing structure in the context of which they exist. So I'm failing to make a very good point here. But the point is that you can consider emergence as what happens when two systems communicate and they bring a higher level of organization with specific interaction, with specific norms, specific entities that do specific things. This is a coherent model of emergence. And from that perspective, you can go all the way down and consider that everything that exists is built by interaction. In itself, this is not, I was expecting to say something edgy, but it's quite simple. Like if you have a phono, if you have an interaction with two particles, it's a new thing that is built by interaction. That is what it is. So the only difference between a radical constructivist view and a classical nomologistic view is whether you think there is a baseline state space, a baseline reality, whether the law of physics pre-exists physics itself. This is kind of metaphysical. I don't want to take any specific commitment in regard to that. But you have the capacity to say, you have a coherent view, at least, that everything that you can observe is built by interaction, that we can call, because of the FEP, any kind of interaction as entailing something like what we call subjectivity, and that therefore objectivity is a meaningless word. You can only observe things in specific terms, and things can interact only in specific terms. So I do not want to enter a debate between subjectivity and objectivity, because I do not think that, I don't think objectivity exists in the world. I don't think it is a word that has a reference. And by contrast, I have no idea how we could possibly define subjectivity.
Okay, yeah, I see. Yeah, maybe we can slightly shift gears and move more to your specific research that you are doing. For example, because I know that you are working a lot on understanding social constraints through the FEP, or this kind of operational closure that you already mentioned. So I'm interested in, for example, because you're working within, cognitive archaeology, sociology, and things like that. So I'm interested in what type of work you do specifically within this context, and what research results have you been getting so far?
So I would say you have two major dimensions to my research. One being the formal/ontological kind that we discussed so far. One being the more applied cognitive science sociology side that we did not discuss so far, but I very briefly mentioned with the example of the Hungarian kids. That is the kind of thing I do. Also, I have no idea what Hungarian kids are like. So the claims I've made here are basically a line of formal research that started with physics of creation and continued with contextuality, cognitive contextuality, something the FEP. Well, a recent paper that I cannot remember the name of. And I would say we have mostly addressed these issues. The one dimension of it that we did not address is, as you said, the concept of social constraints. So one of the problems I have with the FEP, if I did not make clear, is that it acts within a closed set space. It acts with a system that has a predefined dynamics, which does not meet, does not resemble a lytic system at all. So again, as I mentioned before, you have a lot of definition of life, of personal concepts that try to describe what life is and what it characterizes. And in the active tradition, to my knowledge, latest and the one I subscribe to is called closure of constraints. So the idea is you have constraints, which are understood in a physical sense, like if I put my hand here, anything that goes there has to follow the hand. This is what a constraint is. And according to this definition, you have a living system, or at least biological autonomy, if and only if there exists a set of constraints such that each constraint is produced by another constraint, at least one, and produces another constraint, at least one. So what you have is a definition of life that does not hinge on the flesh itself, but that hinges on the I don't know, because activists tend to have very specific definition of structural, operational, and organizational. But you have an organizational property that enables the system to build itself. And this property is based on the, let's say, topology of a system of constraints that are mutually constructive, okay? The thing is, we can, with the FEP, we can explain that. We can explain that, and we can just plainly see it in human. Because if the FEP is warranted as a model of cognition, which I think it is, then cognition works as what you call formally a gauge theory. So it is a kind of theory that it's 80% of physical theories, where you have a certain kind of symmetries. For example, you can move your system in space without changing the formulation. That entails a specific force. So this one is not tied to a force, but I absolutely do not want to explain electromagnetism here and now. This would be a catastrophe. And again, by recent research by Versus AI, Versus Lab, sorry, the FEP is a gauge theory. It is a theory that ties a specific symmetry over probability distribution, this of the system, to specific force that drive a system towards more likely states. It is what a gauge theory is. And the thing is that if you take, again, a physical perspective, symmetry is a constraint. It is something that your system cannot violate by definition. And so by contrapposite, constraints are kind of, maybe are just, but I will say are kind of, a kind of symmetry that is actually physically produced within a system. So if you can explain, so if you can frame a set of belief that is culturally developed, a set of constraints over behavior. So for example, the expectation that, I don't know, I'm allowed to serve myself water without asking for permission when I'm a guest in someone's house. Then when I'm thirsty, I will my attention physically will be driven to a state that produces this behavior. and this is a constraint, and this can be understood by analogy to gauge theory as well, a constraint in a physical sense. And so if you have a set of constraints that self-produces, yeah, you have an organism. But with the FEP, we can claim that a set of beliefs or practices, as they are understood by a community of cultural agents, is a set of constraints. And by the simple fact it's practiced by a community of agents, it is self-constructive. So almost trivially, well, once you let the mathematical background, the inference that there are such a thing as social organization that have the trait of biological autonomy, as defined within the research of Monsieur and Moreno, is quite trivial. And I think it's interesting because of two things. First, it entails that we are actually kind of like cells. We are participants within a broader autonomous organization. So this is nice to think about. Also, maybe also the kind of consequences that there will be if we thought about it too hard are disturbing. So I would not invite people to go into the entire organicist Hitlerian thing. But most importantly, we have some grip to explain open-ended evolution, because we know that social organizations, some of them are autonomous, and we know that autonomy builds open-endedness. So we have some kind of grip to reconcile the conceptual apparatus of the FEP to something that explains self-creation. And I think at least one of my core intentions when starting this research was to create a conceptual ontological framework that is built from the FEP and that actually enables open-ended evolution as a way to better understand how we can frame the FEP as something that enables open-ended evolution. And the core move, as always, is to reframe the natural predefined state and symmetries from actively constructed, to actively constructed constraints. So this is the move in this paper. And I'm afraid it won't get less technical than I explained it. So if you want more detail, just read social constraints, something. This is my best paper, actually, by a good margin, I would say. And then you have the applied research, which is basically a variant of the Hungarian kids thing. So you have constraints, they bring about percepts. This is interesting when we think about ancient organization, because we can tie specific traits of material environments that hopefully we can actually see today ecologically to specific constraints over attention and behavior. So for example, if you are, I don't know, very simple example, if your body movements are more constrained, as they are in a modern classroom, you will have to pay more attention to it. You will have to pay more attention to conform to whatever expectations are set, because you will have to monitor actively your body and your body expression. And yeah, this has very clear intention under, I would say, a near totality of good faith modeling of this system. And this has a very basic explanatory role, even though it is, as I claim it, not extremely schematic. I do not claim it's an actual explanation. It is a nice thing to think about, which is that we started building environments that are, tough to navigate, kind of, how do you say? Like classrooms, places where your movements are clearly intentionally constrained, in contexts where we wanted to build a lot of power and a lot of authority over a captive population. And this attempt worked, because we had the entire modern period, we had an unprecedented scale of political violence in the late 19th and early 20th century. So this entire thing kind of makes sense, and the simple reflection about how cognitively the relation between body expression, between enaction and more conceptual cognition works within the active inference framework. So this is one example that I did not write about it because too much baggage. I do not want to engage too much with Foucaultian stuff, because then I will have angry Foucaultian yelling at me, and I do not want that. So I did more mundane stuff about ritual site in Galicia and the construction of the social and symbolic order as is in the extent that it is manifest in the archaeological evidence. And this is, I'm paid to do archaeology, so I do archaeology. This is, I think the framework works, but I think, it won't be that informative because we don't have that much information. The thing I'm mostly interested in is a very direct consequence about the framework of social constraints, just, its basis. The idea that we are constrained to do things. Well, there is a force that applies toward this outcome when we think we are going to do it. And the way we think about what we do has a name, and it's called identity. So the identity of people, the social construction of how you relate to yourself and you see yourself in the world, is actually a socially constructive force. And I don't think I said anything groundbreaking here, but the fact that I frame it within the FEP, within Active Inference, allows, I would say, a much finer understanding of the relation between, for example, body dynamics, emotion, enaction, engagement within a social landscape than would be possible at a purely narrative level. And also it enables the validation of conceptual insight through modeling, which is not something you possibly have with narrative theory. The specific examples I have studied are nationalism. So that was not a big thing. That was mostly reframing work by a sociologist named Malesevic about the Balkanic nationalism. There is no new insight in that. I said what he said and I called it a new thing. And I claimed Active Inference was a good way to think about it. That's pretty much it. But more recently, I'm finishing a work on the unification church, a weird cult thing that is really powerful, and that was even more powerful before it exploded, its founder dying. And that is known for starting almost by itself the debate about, how do you say, cults, people being abducted and mind controlled by evil satanic cults. And, I hope I do not have to explain why mind control does not work. It is not a thing. We don't have telepathy. If we had telepathy, it would not be that. It would be something else. But what you can do is to work on framing to force an understanding of situation to someone. This is, not something new. We call it gaslighting in common parlance. I can just talk and behave in a way that force you to adopt my framing. Or, I'm taking the example of gaslighting because it is a case where it is considered as coercive. But there is always in any interaction, a meta interaction that defines the framing of the interaction. Oh, you broke a thing, you're a bastard. No, I did not do it on purpose, I'm not a bastard. So if you say that, you accept you broke the thing. This is pragmatically understood from the statement. And all human interaction are, at least linguistic interaction. And I would say it works by analogy to non-linguistic communication. But, pragmatically, we try to agree on a framing of situation and on what we have to do about it. And this is a really deep and powerful mode of human interaction. And there is a lot of psychological study about it. I'm not making it up. So, for example, there is the entire field of agenda setting that focuses mainly on how framing within media influences political dynamics. And what was I going? Oh, yeah. So this is very powerful. And this is something we can understand within the context of Active Inference because, you have the expectation thing that is at play. You have the interaction normat thing that is at play. So framing is just a kind of set of background assumptions that is agreed upon within an interaction. And these assumptions actually causally influence the interaction. And so this is the first point, that this is a thing, and this can be explained or, at least grounded within the language of Active Inference. And there is another thing that there is a specific kind of framing, I will say framing coercion that is especially efficient to build compliance, and that is what I call identity capture. This is when I convince that you, as Maks Valenčič, are the kind of person that gives me money right now. Please do it. And not only, I've said it, you do not believe it. I don't think you believe it. But now assume that I call you a Mooney, and assume that I convince you, I coax you into spending all the time in your working life to devote yourself to Reverend Moon. And you have very big ritual where everyone is happy, and you progressively, they explain to you that how you are supposed to behave. And you think that this is a good place to be, so you behave like that, and it becomes a part of your identity. And then progressively you lose any contact with anyone that is not the Moonies. And then you're told, hey, Max, don't you think the kind of people who gives me money as a Mooney? That works pretty well, actually. There are mountains of lawsuits about this. So it is very clear, two things are very clear. They are very good at getting money this way, and some proportion of people that give them money feel they were conned, they were coerced into giving the money. So yeah, I would say the process behind this are interesting, and it just happens that they give more insight in the more general historical dynamics, how identities are constructed, what is the relation between identity as an abstract construct and actual political mobilization, etc., etc. A lot of things that are very applicable to any field of fields of mostly I would say microsociology and historical sociology that I'm interested in.
And these social constraints, how they are brought about, like how they kind of establish themselves within a specific setting. Like, does understanding, for example, the role of social constraints in various social settings or in relation to identity and so forth, does it give us any predictive power as well, or because I know that this is like a hot, not a hot topic, but this is like disputed territory. But for example, like in your on the Kairos website, you mention how cliodynamics is, for example, one approach at modeling, for example, social constraints and the dynamics between them. But you stress that this is not like kind of a supercomputer as in Asimov science fiction theories, but I'm interested in this predictive aspect of understanding social constraints, and if there are any kind of meta patterns, for example, to social constraints, or kind of if we look at history as this giant database for social constraints manifestation, let's say, what are the underlying patterns or some fundamental structures that, for example, are reappearing or things like that? Like, is there like does it give us an additional insight into more fundamental level, for example, of social interaction and things like that?
So I will answer you on two levels. One is formal and one is conceptual. On the formal level, this is where I have to give a joker. I have no idea how this would work. Because you need the notion that an interaction, brings out something novel, brings out a new thing to pay attention to. And as I mentioned prior, quantum FEP gives you new things, but absolutely no explanation of how and why those specific things are brought about. And classical FEP just forbids new thing to exist. So formally, I have, I could have narrative ideas how this would work. I do not have the skill to develop them into full-fledged theories. So this will have to stay in a kind of limbo state for a moment. I hope that someone agrees with the theoretical, with the, let's say, philosophical and physical arguments that I make, and agrees that we need something new to put there, and that there is some actual collaborative work on that. Else, joker. On the conceptual level, I would say, so this is, at face value, this is, like the FEP, this is a ontological claim about what things are. And it is a claim that gives a a lot of the Goffman stuff about identity and face and framing, kind of internal coherence, and very importantly, that brings it into direct contact with embodiment, the role of your body in your cognition, and enaction or ecological behavior, so the way that you physically engage with the world. So this is Goffman on steroid. It is not. It does not. There is no specific claim that it makes, but I would say you have a few insights that would derive from this framework if it was anything like verified. The core one is that, yeah, the first one at least, the one I want to say first. I don't know if it's the core one. Is that I don't need to make you do things. I just need to convince you you will do a thing for you to do the thing. There is no need for dyadic. There is no need for dyadic interaction for influence to be a thing. I can't just convince you that here we do that, and you will be like, I'm here, so I should do that, and that's the most natural. This is the most straightforward thing to do as a thing with a brain that uses language. Another is regarding basically the evolution of cultural evolution and the evolution of the modern human apparatus. You have a lot of theories of cultural evolution, and I tend to be what I call cognitivist theories. So theories that are focused on traits, cognitive traits, that are biological traits that happen to bear on cognition. So these are things that are you are pretty much born with, or at least you develop pretty deterministically given on your genotype, and they are a specific functional value. So for example, if you have, I don't know, I will take an example that is a bit ridiculous, but this is the one that comes to mind. Maybe you have an inborn tendency to behave better when you see eyes. Maybe that's just how your brain is wired, and you'll do that. And then we'll work with model on agents that have these traits that is well specified at functional level, that is subject to genetic selection. I think this is much more complicated than that. I think to develop something like human societies, you need the development of an ecology of practices that you, as any single kid, needs to be able to understand and integrate. And this gives a lot of different answers in lots of different subfields. So, for example, you have the idea that ritual is kind of opaque, symbolic behavior that has the function to signal norms and to make people integrate norms and to signal group ownership. But if so, how did it develop? How did we get to, like, how did one guy took a, I don't know, cape, a skull, and convince everyone that they need to look at him and do things? I cannot see very convincing evolutionary scenarios to that end. What I could see is for people to develop dancing, singing, synchronic, how do you say, synchronic embodied activity, not as something that has not as something that is selected for genetically or anything, but as a communal practice that actually helps communities, work together, understand what they mean when they gesture at each other, something that could ground an expectation or a trust, and a trust that is operationalized in a very specific way as the expectation that you feel what I feel. So this could be explained without selection, just from the basic dynamics of what a brain is in specific contexts. For example, context of apes that grew groups too big to do grooming and that trying something else. And from there, you can have the development of more and more, centralized thing where there is a guy that leads the ritual, and someday this guy pulls out a skull and explains you it's his father, and you have to follow what his father says. And now you are trained to the skull, through the guy, and you are kind of convinced, because this is something you did all your life. This guy you trust him. Why would you distrust any of this? And so you have a quite difficult problem to solve, which is why humans believe weird theory. Well, weird. From a naturalistic perspective, nonsensical theories about spiritual entities that some guy just happened to know about and you don't, and they tell you what they want. We are a species that evolved language, and that evolved a very strong form of empathy. Usually we are pretty good at spotting liars. So why are we credulous on this? This is a hard problem to solve, and the problem does not exist if we do not talk about lying or credulity, but just as ritual practices that evolved from a state of, from earlier ritualistic practices. So I was not prepared to talk about this. My explanation was extremely schematic. If anyone wants to have the stillman of what I presented, this is basically all the work of Sterelny on cognitive evolution and ritual, which I think is great, and I think is synchronized very efficiently with the framework of social constraints.
No, thank you. And maybe just for the last question, I would like to ask you, because your work has this kind of multidisciplinary approach to it, and you're not afraid to, explore uncharted territories or kind of push, for example, a field or at least your research into a more, let's say, kind of, again, uncharted territories or within some kind of novel direction. And I was interested, for example, on the Kairos website, or your website probably, that you also write fiction, for example, and that you are planning to maybe at some point publish it, or at least, or that you will see how things develop. But I'm interested if you could kind of say some more about this aspect of your work, and, for example, how do you see the role of fiction, and also, like, why specifically do you write fiction?
Why or what?
Yeah, also, like, what kind of setting, for example, are you trying to develop?
Okay. So I wrote an embarrassing volume of edgy teenager poetry that we will not publish. Some of it is good. Maybe I'll publish, how do you say, pseudonymously, but never under my name. No, won't happen. The thing I'm trying to write, and so far failing, is so this is something articulated when I first went into the topic of religion and mysticism. Let's say my education led me to that, but the one thing that I got fascinated by is the universe of Dune by Frank Herbert. I like the Villeneuve adaptation, by the way. And I started imagining a world where you had something very close to the Bene Gesserit, actually, an organization, a religious organization that was made of extremely efficient military soldiers, and that had no interest whatsoever in power, well, at least in overt power, but that are very interested in putting their hands everywhere and trying to tune things in a different way. And the specific moments that I want to write, that I started writing on, is so this is in basically in a close analog to 19th Europe, and it is the moments in the 1830s where, after basically successfully invading half of Europe and bringing down the local equivalent of Napoleon, they get, a bit tempted to push the advantage and go into forms of power that are more explicit. And they fail catastrophically and engage in a civil war over arcane differences of opinion about the use of guns and their philosophical implications, and also because of everyone trying to play 4D chess with each other and mostly failing. So I cited Dune. Basically, this is something that is very inspired by Dune for the universe and the kind of metaphysical reflections, philosophical reflections about religion, beliefs, etc. And manipulation as a tool of power. And The Name of the Rose, the Umberto Eco novel about monks killing each other over interpretation of Plato. So I wanted to have kind of the best of both worlds and have super warrior monks killing each other over arcane interpretation of ancient texts they cannot possibly cite about whether guns are good or bad. Well, not even that. To be good, it would need to be things that you cannot possibly comprehend. So, for example, if you drink whiskey, does this show that you are, a weak human that is unable to control their emotions and not engage into impure behavior, or does this mean that in fact you are pure and you are able to control yourself while inebriated? So yeah, I want to have this kind of arguments, and I want to have it integrated in a very high-stake power struggles where everyone is trying and failing to manipulate each other.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully at least some parts get published and we can read it. But yeah, I think that we can wrap it up here. Yeah. I really want to thank you for taking the time and explaining these things, because they are certainly high level and entail an understanding of at least some, or at least entail understanding of some formal background. So it's always great to have these conversations. And maybe I would just ask you if you could write in the chat the name of the person that you said that explains the same things as Chris Fields, just without the quantum woo stuff. You mentioned during the conversation, I forgot the name.
Oh yeah, Creative Evolution. It's Stuart Kaufman.
Okay. Yeah, I know. The
guy who did the biological autonomy as closure constraints is Maël Monteville. And the guy who did religious studies of the evolution of cognition and religion that I think are extremely constructive is Kim Sterelny. So you can put it in the description. Yeah, and also, generally speaking, so my advisor told me to stay simple in this discussion, which, well, given the question you ask, I could not possibly do. But he is one of the, assuming you have other better, I would say is the best, I would say, vulgarizer, public speaker at Active Inference, and he's so by a significant margin. And his name is Andy Clark.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, that's.
So I think that covers it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, I think that we can wrap it up here. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking with you.